Godspeed. Today, I'm here with Sade, who is the writer and filmmaker for Godspeed. If you're here and you've seen it, you know it's a beautiful, beautiful short film about womanhood, and a lot of other themes are intersected in this film, and I'll let Sade talk about it a little bit more. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Liesl Richardson. I'm a mechanical engineering PhD student at the University of Central Florida. I will be asking some questions to our lovely filmmaker and neuroscientist, Sade. Sade, will you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be able to be here today. Sorry for any background noise. I'm currently social distancing in a coffee shop. But I am going into my first year of my PhD at Princeton Neuroscience Institute. I previously done a 2-year post-bac at Duke University where I was studying neuroeconomics or focusing on neuroeconomics research. And before that, got my undergraduate degree in neuroscience and psychology from Duke University. And then somewhere in there during my post-bac was able to write, produce, and direct Godspeed.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what led you to filmmaking?
Absolutely. So I've always loved films. I think that even from a young age, my parents would take us to the movie theater, and that would kind of be our Friday night treat as a family. And that was when we were living in South Africa. And so it was a really great thing for us to do as a family. But I think I'd always seen it as like a step away from what I could do because I grew up and sort of knew I was going to do something related to science, related to academia. I thought I was going to be a doctor for a super long time. And so my creative pursuits sort of took a backseat in a lot of ways. And in college or during undergrad, I think I would sneak in different opportunities to do different creative endeavors, whether it be a class project or music or art. But it wasn't until my senior year when I took a cinematography class as a random elective that I was doing that I actually got to see the inner workings of what filmmaking looked like and how it happened. And it was truly like a treasure chest was unlocked. I'd really loved the mechanics of filmmaking for a long time. And when I would see pictures on the screen, I'd always wondered how those came about, how did people create those? But it wasn't until that class that I was given the tools to sort of start that journey in understanding how the process worked. And yeah, I just took off from there, and I kept in touch with my professor and said, if there are any at all different creative opportunities or opportunities to be on projects, I'd like to pursue them. And during my second year of my post-bac, I'd listened to Godspeed by Frank Ocean before. I definitely known the song because I'm a huge Frank Ocean fan. But the song came on, and I was just struck with a very powerful visual, kind of imaginary visual in my head where the lyrics and sort of message of the song stuck with me in a lot of ways, and I could elaborate on that for ages on the different kind of themes in that song. And I said, I want to kind of create a response to this. I want to create Godspeed and this message of loving yourself, this message of carrying love and growth through different iterations of who you are across your life into the story of a Black girl becoming a Black woman. But of course, did I have those tools? Did I know what that would look like to actually make it a film? Absolutely not. And so the process of taking Godspeed from just a rough idea into a full-blown production still amazes me. I'm still quite blown away as to how it happened. But it definitely opened the door to then really immersing myself in the filmmaking and creative world, not only through that production, but then also in projects that I've gotten to be involved in subsequently.
Well, that's so amazing. And, you know, you brought up a point about us being scientists or being in the sciences and not really tapping into our creative outlets. I think sometimes that we forget that we are multifaceted individuals and we need to have some kind of outlets to express ourselves. And I think that you found a beautiful way to connect others to your art and to express yourself. So really, thank you for being here today and for talking to us about this journey. That's so wonderful. So my next question for you was, so you already touched a little bit on what inspired Godspeed. It's the song Godspeed by Frank Ocean. And someone asked in the Q&A, what was the song that was playing before? It was Godspeed by Frank Ocean. So can you tell us a little bit more about what inspired the themes that we saw in that film?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the major themes, or like the largest ones that came about for me, was this idea that we grow and we change over multiple different steps and stages of our lives, but we are at the heart of it still that, little kid that just looked at the world in this very doughy-eyed, powerful and all-encompassing way. And in the song itself, the lyrics are so powerful, and anyone who's not familiar with the song, I highly recommend you go and listen to basically Frank Ocean's entire discography. But the lyrics really stuck out to me in the parts where he says, "I will always love you. I'm wishing you Godspeed and glory." And I myself grew up with a very religious background. I grew up with a certain like connotation of faith, of growth, of repentance and restoration. And I think that idea of loving on rather than sort of trying to cast away the past versions of myself is really important. And there are lots of different interpretations of what the song means, whether it's him speaking to a romantic partner, whether it's him speaking to, a friend. But I really took it to mean it was him writing this love letter to his younger self, to his past self. And I think that that was really important, especially when I created Godspeed, or when the idea first came about. I was in a very kind of transitory, I don't know if that's a word, phase of life where I was between my undergrad and between, whatever was going to come next, whether that was grad school or whether that was whatever else it would be. And so I was having to do a lot of evaluation of, am I proud of where I've come from? Do I see the past versions of myself, the less polished versions, the less certain versions, as kind of blemishes on my journey or integral parts of my journey? And I always preface like any talk I give or any sharing I give about Godspeed, the film, to say, it's not autobiographical. It's not me that you're seeing moving through each stage of life. But I think I put a piece of myself in there in this idea that I need to learn how to love those past versions of myself. Other really important themes that I think came about were personhood. So I kind of talked about that with the past versions kind of idea, but then also Blackness. And I think that's really important because in the way that I would consume and sort of see films growing up, and then even like later on, I didn't always see, representations of Blackness, of, Black identities that were diverse, that were multifaceted, that were beautiful instead of just being, cumbersome or about struggle. And so I wanted to sort of also make it a love letter to Blackness, to sort of like identity factors that I saw to be very pertinent, and mask them in beauty and kind of inundate them in color rather than making them seem very flat. And that was really important to me too. And then the last theme that I think really came about was the idea of relationships. And that wasn't one that I was planning it to explore. When I originally wrote the script for Godspeed, I just said, like it's about this one character and her moving through each phase. But in getting input from friends, getting input from collaborators, they said, well, what about this relationship that she has with her mother? Like, what are we saying there? Is the mom just there? Does she just exist? Or is there some sort of idea of passing on of something? And so then it also became a really important exploration of motherhood and kind of womanhood as an identity. Not saying that the two are, immediately intertwined at all, but saying that in the kind of maturation of this character that we're following, the mom isn't just like a side piece in that, but rather a really integral part of the passing on of that identity. And you see that play out in so many different ways throughout the film, both overtly and covertly.
Wow, you brought up a lot of really powerful points and elaborated on a lot of things that I think resonate with our audience. And one of those things is the fact that in media, we are so used to seeing Blackness portrayed with this theme of suffering. Why don't we ever see more stories where Blackness is portrayed for what it is, the diversity of the diaspora? It's out there. And so why aren't we seeing that? And And you gave that to us with Godspeed. So that was just so beautiful. So I just have to say thank you. And I think a lot of our audience is probably thanking you as well, for that beautiful, colorful portrayal of Blackness and of personhood. Because I mean, personhood and growth, loving your past selves, and loving who you are growing into is such an important process to go through in life. I think a lot of people can relate to. And you know, on the theme of the relationship that the character in this film had with her mother, one of our audience members actually brought up their favorite scene, which also happens to be my favorite scene as well. It's the scene where the girl is gripping onto her doll and she's getting her hair done by her mom. And once, my absolute favorite part, the biggest tearjerker, was when towards the end of the film, her hair is done and she looks at herself in the mirror and she smiles. And oh my goodness, my heart soared. So I'm sorry, I'm just like so overwhelmed from that part, just thinking about it. But how did you pick that moment? That was a question from the audience because it was also a favorite scene that they brought up. It brought back flashes of their sister and their daughter. So how did you pick that moment?
Great question. And thank you so much for, I guess, like telling me which scene it was that resonated with you, and to the audience member for bringing that up. It's really interesting because I think in the way that I originally envisioned Godspeed playing out, you have these 4 distinct scenes, right? Like you follow 4 distinct characters at different ages that are going through some sort of journey, whether that's a journey that involves a challenge, whether that's the journey that involves the hair, whether that's the journey that involves the baptism. And although the scenes are very distinct, there are actual like commonalities and parallels between each of the scenes in the way that it progresses. So, you know, you have the introduction to the character, you have the challenge that they face, you have the pain that they go through, or the shock or the worry. And then you have the mother stepping in and kind of being either the comforter or being comforted. And then you have that like resolution at the end where you see that there's been triumph, there's been a victory. And so like that was written kind of into the original script, but it's really interesting to see how when in the eventual edit and the way that I edited it, which parts of that stuck out most. And that final, like I knew I wanted that to be the final shot that people saw, you know, kind of in that whole progression because of how sweet, how pure it is. It's just joy. It's seeing oneself for the beauty that like that. And you know, one of my favorite actresses, the little girl in that scene, her name is Erica Devon, and she's just like brilliant in every single way. And she captured exactly what I was going for, which is just that when she saw herself, she wasn't only just looking at like a cute girl in the mirror, but she was looking at, you know, almost like a woman, but not in the sense that she was grown, in the sense that she was full, and that she was everything that she needed to be in that moment. And that sort of moment, we captured that in each scene. We kind of shot a shot that was very similar to that in each scene, but that one really stood out to me, and it felt like the ribbon on top of the entire story to say that if she's able to arrive at that moment, then not only are the rest of the characters able to do that, but also we are as the audience.
I would definitely agree that as soon as she smiled in the mirror, the first thought that came to my mind was that is self-love. And I know that it's very rare. I think a lot of younger women and just people in general can say that when they're growing up, it's very difficult to find self-love and to love yourself for who you are. And it takes a while for people to get to that point. And just to see a youth sitting there and loving herself and accepting herself, that was just mind-blowing. And I really, really wish that on all the little girls out there. That was, wow, Sade. So thank you for that. And then, you know, speaking of favorite scenes, we have an audience question. They said that the water shots of the film were amazing, and I agree, just gorgeous. They loved the way that you conveyed shifting and transitory emotions, and the lighting was magical. So did those shots come out exactly how you envisioned it?
Another really great question. And I have to give kind of the largest amount of credit to my cinematographer, Steve Milligan, for the way that he shaped those shots, and the angles that we were able to capture, the light that we were able to capture, because we were working in settings where, you know, it wasn't always naturally there. We had to kind of work for it and find it with the colors, with the light. It was raining on so many of the days that we were shooting. And with the water, I think that, I mean, the themes that you mentioned and that the audience member caught on to were all really there, that water represents so much. Like, I guess logistically, it's one of the toughest things to shoot around and shoot with, because you have the equipment, it reflects in different ways, like it can't be controlled. But when you work with it, it can do the most beautiful things. And I think one of the scenes that was so integral to me and I knew I wanted to have in from like the very beginning was that home birthing scene. So when you see the mother like giving birth to the daughter, and that's sort of sandwiched at the beginning and at the very end. And I said, well, water has to be there, you know, like that's key, because it's representing, I guess, like the beauty, it's representing the pain, but it's also representing the birth. Like, so it's renewal, it's soothing, it's all these different things. And then it was just a question of, well, how do I work water into each of these scenes and in different ways? Because there are scenes where it's, you know, very key in the way the scene progresses, and then other scenes where you don't see it featured that heavily. And I think the idea was like the entire piece, one of the things that was really important for me was that it was an immersive experience. So I wanted the audience and just anyone who was watching it, that was consuming it, to feel inundated in everything that was happening. And so I think that both figuratively, water was really important for that, because we all have this like kind of tide, like push and pull with water, but then also very literally, you see the water, you see the way that it plays in the scenes, and it just kind of cements you in that feeling, that thought of the ebb and the flow. And, you know, water's fluid, the story is very fluid. It doesn't necessarily progress in a given linear way. And it's also about renewal and rebirth. So I think, I wonder how much the water shaped me versus I shaped the water over the course of the film, and just like the other elements that really tied in there as well. But water was definitely a huge one.
Wow, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So my next question for you is, you know, you talked about some of the difficulties with using water as an element, right? So can you actually tell us what were the most difficult moments over the course of this project? And then, you know, follow up with what was the most rewarding?
Another great question. I feel like after every question, I'm just going to say, "Ooh, another great question," and because they're all great. Um, it's so important to talk about that, because I think that as much as Godspeed was a labor of love, it was labor. And there were really difficult days and there were really rewarding days. And in talking about the beauty of it and the creation of it, you don't always get to focus on the hard parts as much. I think one of the major things that sticks out to me is like, especially it being my first project, I had to understand how to preserve the initial vision that I had for it, and say, this is this thought, this is this idea that I have, the visual that I want to see and, you know, have play out. And though I'm going to have to compromise that, I don't want to have to settle for something less than what I'm hoping to get with what I have. And that is, I guess it's a lesson in managing one's own pride and expectations in a project, because of course, especially with creative projects, and it's very similar with, I guess, academic endeavors as well, everything is very collaborative. So you're not just working in this insulated sphere where you're the only one who has control over different elements. You want to get input, you want to be able to collaborate with people, you want to be able to share ideas and kind of shop them back and forth. And as important as that is for the process, there's also this trade-off where if you have a very specific idea or goal that you want to accomplish, I was like, English was hard for a second, that you want to accomplish and see something play out in a given way, learning how to fight for that, and learning how to stand up for that. Like, we had location issues at times where, you know, because of communication struggles, because of different logistics, we had locations and we didn't have locations. And there were times where, especially me being at the helm of this project, I had to sort of take the brunt of the responsibility for when things went right, but then also when things went really wrong. And I'm new at this, I'm young. There were times where I had to really take a step back and say, when I'm getting criticism, when I'm getting negative feedback, is that a reflection of who I am as a person and as a creator, or is it just a reflection of ways that I can grow? And there were many times, many times, I have stories for days, where it would have been, and I did actually internalize a lot of the negativity and internalize a lot of the criticisms that came and said, this means that I can't create. And that happens also, again, in the academic sphere, when you get a rejected manuscript, when you get, negative feedback from an advisor or from a presentation, and you say, this means that I can't do, blank. But I think it's really about using that and turning that into a learning experience and an experience to grow, rather than saying that this is the end all be all of my creativity.
Well, you brought up such a really good point, because I think that oftentimes as academics and as scientists, that we think that spending time or taking time out to express ourselves or explore creative outlets, that we won't be able to apply what we learn in our creative expressions to our life in academia. And you just brought up a great learning experience from your art that can be helpful in our science, right? You brought up a very good point. If we get negative feedback, it's not a reflection of our value as a person or as a scientist, but it just means that there's something for us to learn from and to grow from. So thank you for bringing that up. And on the topic of negative feedback, I want to say that this film has a lot of positive feedback. It is an award-winning film. Can you tell us about what it was like to see your film get big and to get all this recognition? Can you tell us where your film has been featured? Tell us a little bit more about that and how you felt.
Absolutely. It's been unreal in so many different ways. I almost have to go back to another moment that happened before Godspeed went into production, when I was talking to one of my collaborators and just about, like, how does one make a film? What does one do? Like, is this, you make one and it's great, you make a bunch and they're all failures, and then you make a good one? And I remember he said something along the lines of, there's a lot of ways into the film world. You could make a bunch of really bad films and then hit the jackpot on the seventh. You could kind of steadily work your way up, or you could make one great one and it sticks out, and, like, that's all you need to make. And I was like, okay, I have to make the greatest film ever. And that was kind of like my mentality at first. But then, and luckily I was able to loosen my grip on that as time went on, and I was brought into the light of, like, realistic thinking. But I think it's been wild to see how positively people have responded to it, and how much it's resonated with people, and different people in different ways. Whether that be people that I've collaborated on it with and they knew the story, but, like, seeing it come to fruition really impacted them, or complete strangers that were just like, I saw this and it really made a difference. And I think some of the most awesome opportunities that I've gotten to showcase the film thus far have been with Sundance. So I actually got to, or I guess, I don't remember the timeline, time barely exists anymore, but a few months ago submitted it to a short film challenge that they had, and kind of completely forgot that I submitted it. And then a few months later, I think it was probably a month or so ago, heard back from them and said, oh, you actually are now a finalist in this competition that we have. And we loved your film and we loved everything about it. And I got to go through the process of interviewing for this, amazing Sundance fellowship, and talking to Sundance coordinators. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Sundance, Sundance Institute is this really just great, very prominent film body that exists, that also put on the Sundance Film Festival every year, that some people are super familiar with. And so, although I didn't end up getting that fellowship, even still, the piece resonated so much with some of the mentors in the program that one of the mentors, a filmmaker named Malik Vital, reached out to me afterwards and said, I want to mentor you. I want to guide you through the film world and just, like, connect you with people who also will really love this piece. And so, I guess in my mind, I thought of it as like, oh, I got Sundance's attention somehow with this, which is wild. I also had the film featured in Free the Work, which is a fantastic filmmaking platform that really amplifies and highlights underrepresented voices in the film world. And it was created by another amazing filmmaker, Alma Harrell, who I sent the film and she watched it and said, oh, I want to feature this on our website like yesterday. And so getting to interview with her and interview with her team was really fantastic. And then just with the film festivals that it's been featured at, there have been some where I've won awards for, most inspirational poem, most inspirational film, best spoken word, and I have to give all the credit to my spoken word artist who just really killed the poem. Fantastic. And then recently just won best of festival at a different festival. And there are other opportunities, other things that are coming up in the woodworks, like different, streaming platforms that it might get featured on, different festivals just with like huge audience membership that it might get featured on. But I think one thing I love to say, or I want to say, is that as much as the film festival recognition has been great, and as much as the press recognition has been great, what's been most rewarding for me personally is seeing the way that it's personally resonated with the different individuals that have seen it, that they said, I got chills at this moment, I cried at this moment, I felt this at this moment, because I think that was my, other than me saying I have to make the greatest film ever, my initial motivation was I want to make a story that people feel, that they see themselves in, that moves them emotionally, whether they can relate or whether it's a foreign experience to them. So that's been the most rewarding for me personally.
Wow, that's amazing. So I guess you're reaping some of those rewards here today as we're talking about it. So you brought up the spoken word, and we actually had a question about that. So what came first, the spoken word poem or the concept for the film?
Awesome question. Thank you again. So it was the idea that came first, but at the time, so I reached out to a slew of different spoken word artists that I knew, many of them that were within my network from Duke University, from undergrad, that I knew, that were just like fantastic people while I was at Duke, and I also knew that they were fantastic artists. And so when I came up with the initial idea for Godspeed and kind of had an outline, had some semblance of a script at that point, I reached out and said, hey, I have this project. I think it would be really powerful to have a poem or a spoken word piece over it. I'll send you the outline, I'll send you any details that you need, and just write something and let me know. And several different artists came back to me after that with like different interpretations essentially of what they saw the piece to be and what parts of it resonated with them and the kind of art that was inspired from it. But I think Nani's piece stuck out to me actually kind of later than I expected, because I read it initially. I was like, oh, this is a really beautiful and powerful poem. Like, awesome, I'm tucking this in my back pocket. And it wasn't until I got into the editing suite, and she sent me like a kind of like iPhone voice note of her reciting it, just, very casually. And I was like, okay, let me just play around with this, import the voice note, see how it goes. And very soon those words, the poem, and kind of her rhythm, her pace as she was narrating it, became the skeleton by which I started editing it. And so though the idea and the concept were there, and then the piece followed subsequently, the poem itself, it was also very integral in the way that I pieced together the visual, because I said, this really gives me a guide to the highs, the lows, the stops, the beats. And so it's like, instead of it being a what came first, the chicken or the egg, they kind of came a little bit like intertwined at the same time. So, and that's art for you, I guess. It was really beautiful to see it come together.
Love that. Thank you for sharing. So I kind of want to switch gears a little bit because we have a couple of audience questions. Neurocinematics. We brought it up on our Twitter. A lot of folks are like, what is that? So the first question that we have from the audience is, how would you say the film Godspeed encompasses the principles of neurocinematics? And before you dive into answering that question, can you just give us a brief explanation of what neurocinematics is?
Absolutely. So neurocinematics, first of all, is a term that people have used. It exists. I made sure, and I'm really trying to like bring it to the forefront of every conversation. So I'm trying to make neurocinematics happen, essentially, much like fetch. But I would define it, or the best definition, as just the neuroscience of film. So it's understanding how visual experiences impact the brain, whether that be elements of memory, elements of perception, or elements of social cognition. And actually, I'm going to get to talk about this a little bit more during a Skype a Scientist session tomorrow, where I'll be kind of catering it to a high school audience. But if people are curious, definitely tune in then. But in my kind of analysis or understanding right now, because I'm only at the beginning of really my career in understanding and evaluating neurocinematics as a field, it's saying that how do we take naturalistic events, so naturalistic stimuli such as visual narratives, and use them to understand more about why we work the way that we work, whether that be the way that we see the world around us, whether it be the way that we relate to people, or whether it be why certain memories stick out to us more than others. And the way that I'm really interested in tying that all together is through the lens of emotions, so saying, you know, what is it about the affect that is elicited through a visual experience, or the way that our affective states influence our visual experiences? How do those two work together, and how can that tell us more about just the way the brain works? But in thinking about the way that that all tied together in Godspeed itself, it's wild to think about like the timeline of how everything played out, because before creating Godspeed, I wasn't interested in neurocinematics. I actually didn't know that the field existed of like using naturalistic stimuli to understand more about the brain. And so I approached Godspeed initially just from a perspective of, well, I've never made a film before, but I know certain things about the sensory modalities. I know certain things about, you know, how you can create a visual experience and make it be very immersive in a lot of different ways. And I want to take that cognitive knowledge into the way that I'm building this film. And I think the gaps in my filmmaking knowledge were very much filled by my kind of knowledge of a cognitive approach to understanding experiences. So saying that you want to make something that hits on the different senses. So it's not just about what you're seeing and having a narrative that's like fun to look at and follow, but also the auditory experience of it. So like the soundtrack, the score, is it creating an ambiance that really just pulls you in, that matches or complements the rhythm and the pacing of the visual narrative? Thinking about the characters, what you're seeing in them, like what mood is the lighting creating? Are we trying to kind of show the audience tension? Are we trying to show them joy? Are we trying to show them sorrow or kind of melancholy? And thinking about how the way that you color grade, for instance, color grading being kind of the color that you set the scene to be, how can that communicate that as well? And these are all things that exist kind of intrinsically within the film world, that directors, editors, cinematographers make these really intentional choices as to how to do that. But I didn't really have that knowledge, that vocabulary at the time to understand how to approach it from that direction. So I just said, well, as a neuroscientist or as a neuroscientist in training, I think considering these elements are very important. And so Godspeed in a lot of ways was my first experiment or study in neurocinematics of creating something of an ambiguous narrative. You know, if you are just watching the film without any context, are you still able to be emotionally moved by it? Like, does it elicit certain emotional and affective states? But then also, does it guide you both visually and then also sonically through the piece? And so all sorts of different elements that factored in there. And I thought a lot about the storyline. Like, I didn't want it to be just you going from point A to point B in a story and getting kind of like predicting what's going to happen. I wanted people to move through it at their own pace, gather from it whatever they wanted to gather, and not have to kind of be guided through the process. Because I think there's a lot about, like, when we're watching a movie, do we know what's going to happen at the end? Like, is there a predictive quality to it that either excites us or bores us, things like that, which I think the utility of that prediction and the reward also was something that probably my decision-making, techniques or my decision-making research experience was guided by. And so, yeah, I think all of those things came together and then really shaped when I was then introduced to naturalistic stimuli work. I said, oh, there's an actual field that exists to study this, and that's all I want to do for the rest of my life now. And so I'm really hoping that it carries through into future pieces that I do, both creatively, but then also future work that I do scientifically.
That's amazing. And I don't want to speak for everybody, but I'm going to speak for myself and say I'm very much looking forward to future films and anything that you create from this point forward. So on that thought, do you have any themes in mind for future films or that you hope to capture?
Absolutely. I think in a lot of ways, I want to continue on the strain that I've already started in this depiction of Blackness and having kind of multifaceted, more complex and nuanced depictions of Blackness and color on camera. But even more so than that, this idea of depicting relationships, depicting self-actualization and progressing and growing and maturing as people. I mean, I really love a non-linear narrative. I love when you're able to garner your own findings and conclusions from a particular story. And I also love anything with music. I mean, I talk a lot about the different influences and inspirations and references that I brought into creating Godspeed. And they're from directors such as Barry Jenkins and Edgar Wright, Wes Anderson, Alma Har'el herself, and so many others that create these stories that you have to watch over and over and over again to really kind of find the different Easter eggs and different pieces of it. And even after watching it the third or fourth time, you find something new every time. They're very layered, they build on each other. So I think that's one thing I really want to explore, especially as I mature in my craft creatively and then also mature in my craft in understanding more about how those things work in the brain. I think another thing that I want to explore is just the idea. So a lot of the pieces, so Godspeed, sorry, I should finish the sentence. I guess Godspeed is my first short film that involved kind of like a large scale production in terms of pulling in producers, having a crew. But it's not my first creative project and isn't my latest creative project in the sense that I've had personal films that I've created that those existed for me to kind of go through a process of emotionally processing things that were going on. Like I had another short film, well, I kind of call it a short film, named Tulips that I created my senior year that was about me kind of charting the emotional processing of my father being diagnosed with a brain tumor. And that was a very personal piece. Like that wasn't one that I shared with many people because it was my way of cathartically working through that process. And I also have Bodies, which is a more of an edit because I didn't shoot any of it myself. It's not my original footage, but it's a homage, I don't know how that word is pronounced, to Black bodies and Black beauty. And I just drew from kind of my favorite examples of Blackness in media, whether that be films, trailers, music videos. And so I think a clear theme that I get is that I focus a lot on family, but I also focus a lot on kind of like personal, very intimate aspects of existence. So the way our bodies move, the way our emotions feel. And I want to continue in that and make sure that's highlighted and it's very intentional, but I also want to be able to branch outside of that. And with some of the future projects that I might do, we'll see if I kind of branch more into the comedy side of things because I love a good comedy. Hot Rod and Scott Pilgrim versus the World are like two of my favorite films in the world. And just other things. So I want to be able to approach that intentional filmmaking, but also diversify the way that I have those conversations and create that discourse.
Wow, beautiful. And thank you for sharing something so personal about your previous projects. I see that you've been using this to help you in your own personal life, and that's amazing that you could find an outlet. On on that theme, there's an audience member who feels like their creative self is in opposition to their identity as a scientist. Did you feel any guilt in pursuing both? And I don't know if you want to dive into that, but yeah, I mean, sometimes it can be difficult to pursue both. So can you elaborate a little bit?
Absolutely. That's so real. That's so real. And I think that I for a very long time, I felt that I had to choose either or. I mean, I talked a little bit at the beginning about growing up and being this very curious girl who liked to, ask questions about the way the world worked and automatically being funneled into this path of, oh, well, now you're definitely going to be a doctor or you're definitely going to be a scientist. You're definitely going to be this, like A, B, or C. The path was very clear cut. And I definitely tried venturing outside of that in many ways. You know, I was heavily involved in sports in high school. I was heavily involved in different artistic endeavors like yearbook club. Shout out to any of my yearbook club friends. None of y'all are on this, but I still love you. And just different ways of exploring it. But they always felt like a little bit of like cheating on my original or my set path of science and sort of epistemological or like empirically focused work. And so I think that one thing I want to say is that it's going to be different for absolutely everybody, because the way that people express themselves artistically is different for absolutely everybody. The way that I do or I create my art is not going to be the same as the way someone else approaches or creates their art, even if we're using the same medium, even if it's through film. But you can do it through music, you can do it through performance art, you can do it in so many different ways. And I think one thing that I had to tell myself, especially when I did feel guilty, and explaining to my friends that, you know, oh yeah, I'm creating a short film, explaining it to my parents, explaining it to my colleagues, my mentors, my employers at the time, because I was working full time in the lab when I was creating Godspeed. I had to make peace with myself and say that, you know, Sade, you have to walk through this door if the door is open, and you'll stop if it's clear that it's meant to be shut. If you'll stop if it's clear that it's like hindering the different ways for you to kind of grow as a person. But I had to reevaluate what success looked like for me, and give myself breaks when I needed breaks, because it was a very, you know, arduously demanding process to create a piece of art on this scale while also working full time, while also preparing to apply for grad school. And even now, where I exist at this like precipice, this crux between the two worlds, I have to be very intentional between, you know, preparing myself for grad school. Like I'm next week, I'm starting with some pre-boot camp work for my PhD at Princeton, while also, you know, reading scripts, working on projects. I think I have to listen to myself. It's very much about not seeking validation from those around you, either academically or creatively, listening to the input that they give, but not seeking validation from those sources, because only you know what your intention is behind the way that you create. And when I say create, I mean both artistically and also scientifically. And so if you feel that nagging, that feeling of it continuously pulling you in, and that it's something that that's meant to be part of your identity, then I don't think that's something that you should suppress or ignore. I think you should evaluate and kind of consider the ways that you can explore that, meld that into your identity. Like, I'm very lucky that I get to approach my science with my film in mind, or my art in mind, right? Like, Neurocinematics exists and will exist even more, hopefully, years down the line. And so that's a way that I get to merge the two. But, you know, some people's research practice is very different and distinct from the art that they create. And that's fine too. It doesn't have to be like two birds, one stone. It's just about making sure that you at your center feel fulfilled, feel self-validated, and feel like what you're doing intentionally.
Beautiful response. Beautiful response. Thank you. I hope that whoever that audience member was, that they can find some peace in pursuing both. It's totally okay, as Sade elaborated on, so thank you for that. So my next question is from an audience member as well. So they remember when Insecure, the show on HBO, first came out, and how there was a lot of talk about how the shots of Black people was perfect because they correctly used lighting. And typically Hollywood didn't care about that in the past. And you know, okay, there's a lot of examples, not just in film, but also in editorials and magazines. So, you know, how have you, so have you found that now in film, this is something that is taught and considered? Do you think it's getting better? Do you have any other examples in film where, like Insecure, they use better elements of lighting to portray Black characters?
Great question. I think there's so much I could say here, honestly and truly, but this is being recorded, so I won't pop off too much. One of the biggest things to consider is that, you know, in the creation of any project, you don't just have the director who's influencing the creative choices that are being made. you have the cinematographers, you have the colorists, you have the editors. Like it's an entire team that goes into creating something a certain way. And I think Insecure is a fantastic example of how the cinematography choices were just on point. Like the lighting is amazing. I think for a lot of the seasons, I'm not sure about the latest season, but Ava Borowski, I might have just butchered her name, was the cinematographer for that. And she knows how to light dark skin. Like it's a very specific method that's used to light darker skin tones, to light just non-white skin tones. And she approached it that way and kind of created or added to the canon of how to do that. I would say that in looking for examples, you have to look for cinematographers who know how to do that. There are so many examples like Black cinematographers, of course, bringing in their own personal experience. They're even better at doing that. And I wish I could name some off the top of my head. Like Bruce Cole is fantastic. He does work. He's actually based in Durham, or he's from Durham, North Carolina, which is where I shot Godspeed. And he's one that I just follow and love all the work that he's done with, Ava DuVernay on Queen Sugar. He's doing work right now, and he's done work with other small filmmakers that I'm really a huge fan of. And there are other examples too, but I can't remember names off the top of my head. And so I think following cinematographers who know how to light really well, who know how to pay attention to those things, because cinematography is at its core dynamic photography. So when you see a cinematographer who knows how to light, you also then will see someone who would know how to light someone in a photograph or in a shoot that for still images, because I think that's been a huge discussion or discourse in recent times as well. And so Moonlight is another fantastic example for me, and was like huge, like major source material for Godspeed. Like everything Barry Jenkins touches turns to gold in my mind. So Moonlight, If Beale Street Could Talk, he of course paid attention to that, but also his cinematographers paid attention to that. And so it's really not only following people who do that, but then also following the people that they follow that do that. And seeing how they carry that process through, and not like try to compensate for dark skin tones, but actually celebrate dark skin tones.
Beautiful. You brought up some amazing examples. Love Moonlight and If Beale Street Can Talk. So thank you. And we're also getting a lot of questions just on the intersection of science and art. So just to merge all of these questions into one, because there are a lot, how does art inform neuro and vice versa? And do you see more artists, regardless of the media that they use, considering neuro in their practice?
Great question. I would say so right now, at least at this point in my career, I speak more from a place of observation rather than expertise. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, and I might change my answer a few years from now. But I think that one way that art informs neuro and neuro informs art is by kind of recognition of the middleman, which is culture. So science has always been an influence on culture, and culture has always influenced science. Science, and I actually wrote a piece on this called Seeing Color, which is about kind of scientific racism within the field of neuroscience, that says that existing, or the scientific community trying to exist at this precipice or at this standing off point where we say that we're objective or neutral, we're not influenced by, like subjective opinions and such, is inherently and historically incorrect. It's not true. And they've always been kind of like had this bi-directional influence on one another. And so thinking about the way that we think and create our science being influenced by culture, we can also think about how visual culture comes into that. We think about the way that stereotypes are portrayed on screens. We think about the way that we see characters either be very dynamic if they're of certain races. Like, what does it mean that in a lot of rom-coms for years on end, you had the white character with the Black best friend who was funny and sassy, but didn't have much depth beyond that? Like, what does that do for our mainstream understanding and kind of like idealization of Blackness and what that means? How do we portray these things? How do our stereotypes either perpetuated or defeated? And you also think about just the way that I think I'm trying to like figure out the best way to answer it. Especially I consider a lot within the realm of cognitive neuroscience and human neuroscience, because that's the field that I'm currently cemented in, where if you're doing research on given populations, they bring in their own biases, they bring in their kind of predispositions to thoughts, to different ideological standpoints that are going to influence the way, especially if you're studying things socially, the way that they answer and respond to questions. And so thinking about the way that they consume media, and one reason I love neurocinematics, or the reason I love naturalistic stimuli work in general, is it's saying that you can't just consider a person's behavior within an experimental bubble, right? Like, we are inherently, beings, we are inherently subjects that take in so many different forms of influence from the world around us. And when we're asking research questions, we have to try and make our research generalizable and say, what is this person's reaction or response going to be outside of this, vacuum of a research facility, outside of our experimental control? And so naturalistic stimuli work approaches it from saying these are things that they'd see in the real world, and hopefully this is how they react in the real world. So that's kind of one train of thought. And then in the ways that neuro influences art, I mean, neuroscientists or scientists in general are, academia in general, let me just speak about academia in general, is lauded at such a high, empirical level, where we say, oh, every research or every article, whether it's in a research piece or in some sort of like mainstream news, is like, scientists from blank school say this, that, or the other, they've found that this, that, or the other. And inherently that's going to feed into the way that society codes and society kind of understands the world. And thinking about how much of the filmmaking process, how much creativity is influenced by cognition and kind of cognitive perspectives on things, it's almost wild that it hasn't been considered or more considered before this point of how the two are so intertwined. Because one, it's not just like a one direction of influence. They are very much in kind of an ebb and a flow constantly, a very dynamic relationship. I don't know if that answers your question, but I have a lot of thoughts on that. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah. We could probably have a whole other event just talking about some of the things that you brought up, the way that culture influences our science and vice versa. And then you also brought up a lot of points about how media portrays the different tropes of Black characters and how that informs inherent biases about Black folks in general. And people bring that into their research as scientists. People bring that into everyday life and their interactions with Black people. So that's a very, very good point. But I won't belabor that because that could be an entire event in itself. So we do have another audience question. So their comment is that the film is wonderful and that it actually resonated with them as a non-Black individual. A non-US Black individual. So the reason for that is the imagery and the story seems to transcend subcultures, African-American, Afro-Caribbean, and it touches on a lot of commonalities. Was that an active choice?
I think it was I don't know if I can speak to it being an active choice, but I think that was the lens through which I was actively viewing the film. So I myself am a first generation American. My mother is South African, my father's Nigerian, and I spent most of my kind of like formative years of childhood growing up in South Africa. And so I only really stepped back into the realm and lens of American culture and Black American culture when I came to college and kind of had to relearn culture, which I could expand on that because I think that is a weird phrase to use. But I think that I've existed in something of like an amorphous culture for most of my life, where I've always been outside of a culture of my own origin because I don't necessarily know if I have a culture of my own origin. But in especially my latter years of exploring my identity, understanding how Blackness is not a monolith at all. It's very multifaceted. It's very nuanced. It's very complex. It's so colorful. And I think that I loved in that piece getting to illustrate certain elements of it that, are specific to certain cultures, but also are kind of transcendent of that. And just saying that we're highlighting Blackness in general, not Black Americanness, not Black Africanness. And I think that I speak to that because I think I might have said this before, but like Godspeed only tells a very specific story of what Blackness looks like, of what womanhood looks like, of what motherhood looks like. And I was very cognizant in creating it that I wasn't trying to speak for everyone, because if anything, it was my attempt to tackle this whole idea of identity being a monolith and Blackness being a monolith. And so I'd hoped that in the lens that I was approaching it and saying, you know, I'm observing certain elements of this cultural piece. I'm drawing from my own experience of certain elements of this cultural piece. Hopefully it transcends those barriers and kind of seeps into and leaks into subcultures. Because if anything, me being a Black woman that's creating does not necessarily give me permission to tell the stories for all Black women or all Black people or all women. I can only speak and draw from things that I've either studied or my lived experiences.
Beautiful. So we do have one last audience question, and then we're going to wrap things up. So you brought up Queen Sugar when we were talking about examples of film with good lighting. So this audience member felt that Queen Sugar evoked similar feelings for them as Godspeed. So have you applied your method or analysis to other work? And what are some examples that you think highlight the importance of neurocinematics?
Huge question. And I think one thing I want to say is in the examples that I cited just then, those are just the ones that, you know, popped up from the top of my head. But my library of reference is constantly expanding. I think one thing that I've learned, and that's resonated with me so much, is that I, in myself, in growing in my understanding and in my consumption of media, have a somewhat limited library in what I know and what I've studied thus far. Like, just because Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk were the first references that came to mind for me in depicting Blackness does not mean that they're the first or that they'll be the last. And so I think that I drew a lot for Godspeed, especially from short films that I found, whether those be short films that just had beautiful depictions of Blackness or whether they had beautiful depictions of womanhood and motherhood. Like, that list was very diverse in a lot of different ways. And since then, I think I've made a concerted effort to really consume more examples, especially in the current sphere where there are creators who are just making amazing things. Like, some of the films that I've watched recently that have just really impacted me include Last Black Man in San Francisco, include Selah and the Spades, include just like all of Insecure, honestly. And there's so many more, because I think we have kind of our, and I May Destroy You, which is out on HBO. Like, if y'all haven't watched that, it's wild, you should watch it. I think one thing that's been really highlighted for me is that there is so much out there, and some of it's in the mainstream, some of it's like kind of sources that we see and that are like very much pubbed and like are elevated. And then some is more niche and nuanced work. Like, I've been introduced to the work of Janixa Bravo, I've been introduced to the work of A.V. Rockwell, and there's so many creators who do amazing things, whether it's, you know, overt or covert, there it is, examples of Blackness. So I think it's seeking out, and once you find one that really resonates with you, like I said before, seeing what they reference, seeing what other things people have watched that they say, this really stuck with me in a lot of different ways. And I know I'm forgetting so many, which makes me sad. I'm like, oh, I wish I had like all of my references off the top of my head, but there are so many.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know that we're a little bit over time, so I'm just going to wrap up with this one last question. So what do you want, or what do you hope viewers take away from this film?
Great last question. All of the questions have been great, but that's a great last one. If you feel something, then I did something right. If you feel moved emotionally, if you feel like you could relate to the characters, if you take a moment to meditate on your own past selves and the journeys that you've been on, and whether or not you have that feeling of love and appreciation for yourself, then that's all I could possibly want. If you cried, awesome. If you didn't cry, also awesome. You know, I think the emotive expression that it's supposed to elicit is supposed to be diverse. I didn't hope to just accomplish one thing. And so I hope it makes you walk away with a deepened appreciation of Blackness, Black womanhood, especially. I think I want to tie those two together as well as separate them. And that it's something that made you feel just captured in that moment for that? It was a little chunk out of the time, the time space continuum, and you just felt captured in it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Sade. And I will say personally, I saw myself just for a smidgen of the film. I saw myself, and now, you know, and that's such a unique and rare realization when you can see yourself portrayed in the media that you're consuming. It's such a powerful thing. And I hope we continue to see more of that. And we're looking forward to seeing more from you, Sade. So thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you to our sponsors for making events like this possible this week. And just a reminder, our Neuro art contest on Twitter and Instagram is still happening. And it will be happening all through Sunday, 11:59 p.m. EDT. And yeah, that's all we have for you today. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. You make good choices. If you haven't already, watch Godspeed.